Humans are remarkable primates in a lot of ways. And some of the most important ways have to do with our social dynamics, the way that we cooperate with each other, the way that we work together. Obviously, when we think of how that could have emerged in our evolution, we really have to compare very broadly among different kinds of wild primates who have different kinds of social groups and different styles of interactions. Agustín Fuentes is a primatologist who's a professor of anthropology at the University of Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana. Agustín has worked for many years with wild primates on a diversity of social scales. And he came here to visit us at the University of Wisconsin to talk about his work. I talked to him about his history in working with wild primates, the way that he thinks that group dynamics in wild primates can tell us about the evolution of cooperation, and the way that primates can serve as models for understanding ancient hominids.
I know that people are going to be interested in lots of different things, so I'm going to try to ask about some things like, how did you get into anthropology?
I didn't start as an anthropologist at all. In fact, when I became an anthropologist as an undergraduate major, I was at the time a double major with zoology and theater arts. So I was a zoologist, and that was really what I was interested in at the time.
Sure.
But then I took a class in anthropology, primatology actually, and was blown away. And then I took some cultural anthropology courses, and I took some archaeology courses, and I realized there is a discipline out there that asks the big questions about why and how and what it means to be human. And once I realized that you could do this for a living, I was hooked.
Cool. So how did you get out of the field the first time?
I did some, as a graduate student, I did captive work with non-human primates, with tiger monkeys. And I did some research on seagulls, dusky-footed wood rats. I did some ethnographic work on urban powwows in the Bay Area. And then when I was out to do my dissertation field work, I was going to go originally to Yemen to do some research there on baboons. But it turned out there was a civil war and some other things that didn't work out very well. So I didn't go. And a colleague of mine was doing some work in Indonesia. And said, why don't you come out here and look for a site? So I spent 2.5 months traveling around Indonesia looking for a field site, and I found many of them. And continued to work there for a long time.
Did you start out with macaques?
No, I actually started out, my dissertation research is on a leaf monkey called Presbytis potenziani, the Mentawai Island leaf monkey. That's a fairly rare leaf monkey found only on the remote Mentawai Islands, a small chain of 4 islands off the west coast of central Sumatra in Indonesia. So it was, at the time, considered to be the only monogamous sort of colobine leaf-eating monkey. Turns out it's not so much, but that was part of my learning experience as well.
Not so much the only one, or not so much monogamous?
Not so much monogamous.
Yeah.
As most of our studies of primates demonstrate.
Well, this is a really interesting issue, and it's sort of what brings you into thinking about humans and their prehistory, because there is this complexity about mating systems and our stereotypes about what mating systems are like in different primates, and the reality that mating systems are messy sometimes, they're flexible sometimes, and you've written a lot about this.
So I'm really interested in differences between social systems and mating systems, because there are important differences, and we tend to mix the two up, not just when studying primates, but even more so when studying humans. People tend to take marriage and pair bonding and human mating monogamously, polygamously, polyamorously, whatever, and sort of think they're the same thing. They're not at all. There's actually a whole bunch of different levels that we're talking about, levels of analysis here, right? So we can talk about the evolution of certain kinds of social systems that have very, very complex mating ranges within them. So what humans do is have a lot of sex, even relative to other primates. How they do that, historically, currently, behaviorally, evolutionarily, all of those things are very interesting questions, but they don't have just one answer.
Okay, this seems like such a happy message, that we have a lot of sex.
We also have, of all the primates out there and pretty much all the mammals, the highest rates of sexually transmitted infections. So I don't know if it's all good.
No, I mean, this is a tremendously under-recognized aspect of life in humans, in human groups, is the effects of STDs and their effects on fertility in so-called natural fertility populations.
Right.
Natural fertility is suppressed fertility in many respects.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to stick to primates for a little bit.
Okay.
All right. A lot of people thinking about our origins, they recognize that primates are our relatives, and they're relevant for that reason. But I think that you're in a really good position to give even a deeper answer about why we study primates. You know, what is it that you're hoping to get when you're looking at primates?
So, I mean, there are many ways to answer this. The most important one, and this is what people don't realize, I mean, because of my training as a zoologist, humans are primates. So the whole idea of studying primates to learn about humans is like studying, you know, a wide variety of rodents to learn about rats.
Right.
So the point is we are primates. And so that's the first question, a comparative approach to understanding what it means to be human. We also have to understand what it means to be chimpanzee or macaque or woolly spider monkey or what have you. Now, another way to answer this question is to understand the patterns that are common amongst primates or common amongst apes, as opposed to those things that are distinct in humans.
Right.
So we have to know the commonalities and the distinctions. And so we can't really know what it means to truly be human without also knowing what it means to be primate as a human. And those are the ways I'd answer that question.
After you got out in the field, you did your dissertation work, you continued working in Indonesia, but you started working with other kinds of primates. What were you hoping to get when you started looking beyond, you know, the leaf monkeys and started thinking about, you know, how do other primate social systems work?
So what really happened was that during my dissertation research, I happened to choose the one primate species that spends almost all, or one of the few primate species spends almost all of their time above 30 meters in the tree, that are really hard to see and that don't do much. So it became very evident right away that I was going to collect a lot of other data as well, ecological data, all sorts of other things. And actually I ended up watching gibbons almost more than the species I was supposed to be watching. The upshot of that is I learned that there's complex ecosystems, that things aren't simple. I also realized that I was out in a very remote jungle, but the humans lived there as well as the primates, as well as snakes and a variety of other things. So it was the relationship of all the organisms within an ecosystem that I became very interested in.
Okay, so you started on this sort of, you know, that was really an important part of your work very early.
Right.
Is this ecosystem view. Okay.
Absolutely. And so then I happened to be at a conference in Bali in 1994. I had been in Bali in 1989 and been fascinated by the macaques at temples and running around. When I was back in 94, I was really struck at how many macaques and how many people there were and how ubiquitous this was on the landscape. And I thought, wait a minute. You know, we think of, to study primates to understand, you got to go to some remote jungle where there are no people, even though there are some people. How about studying the primates where there are lots of people? We're always worried about those primates who are going extinct because of human encroachment, the primates that aren't making it. So I thought, what about studying the primates who do well around people? We could ask the question, an equally important question, why do the primates who do well around people, as opposed to why are the other ones going extinct?
So do you know why they do well? I mean, it has to do with their social system, I presume.
I think macaque monkeys do extremely well around wherever they are on the planet, as do baboons in Africa. So the baboon-macaque radiation is sort of one large cluster, evolutionarily speaking. Macaques do really well around people for a couple reasons. One, we're a lot alike.
Yeah.
Humans and macaque monkeys are a lot alike in many important ways. Immune function, digestion, sort of foraging choice. Macaques also have a very sort of cohesive social system that can be in big groups and small groups, and it's flexible. So they're able to live on edge environments, in central forest environments, in riparian environments, all over the place, like humans. They're also really able to deal with lots of fluctuations in social structure, stability, instability, things like that. So it turns out plasticity and the ability to respond to changing dynamic situations is probably a good indicator of how well you're going to do if you have to live with people.
So why isn't every species plastic like this?
That's a great question and probably one of the most important questions in evolutionary biology. Why don't all species do the sort of safe thing and adapt to hyperdynamic environments? And I think the reason is many species aren't exposed to hyperdynamic environments throughout much of their evolutionary history. And I think that there are multiple ways to be a good X, whatever species that is you're talking about. So while macaques took one way to do this, the guenons in Africa took a different. They became very arboreal and focused on fruits and leaves. And they do extremely well in their context. So I think there are many, many ways to be successful in a lineage. But those lineages in the last, couple 100,000 years that have to deal a lot with humans, especially in the last couple thousand years, we're seeing a winnowing effect, because those that are able to be flexible in response to the way we as humans radically change the world are those ones that probably have the best shot at coexisting down the road.
Well, another area in which we see the winnowing effect is in our own lineage, because we have these ancient kinds of hominins. They're now extinct, and it's a continuing problem in the study of our evolution. How is it that these species that once existed, that seemed to be successful, that seemed to adapt well, why did they go away? And what led to the success of our lineage? I know you've been thinking about this issue. So how would you approach that question? As just looking at it, coming at it from the angle of primatology. Right. Where do you get into the issues of these extinct hominins?
So I think there's two ways. One is the sort of comparative approach. Let's look not just at our lineages, the hominins. Let's look at other primates, maybe even other mammals, clusters of related species, where one species does well or some species do well, and try to figure out what those relationships are. That's one place to look. I think for our interests, maybe looking at hyenas, social carnivores like dogs as well, might be good places to learn a few things. I think there's some interesting insight there. From the other primates, logically, most people want to look at the apes, right? So the humans' closest relatives. The problem is, 10 million years ago, there were tons of apes, many, many different lineages. Now there's only a few, and we're all weird. Chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, humans, and gibbons are all pretty much weird relative to what apes looked like 10 million years ago. So the ape comparison isn't always very good. Within our own lineage, then, we have to really ask the question, not what makes us good as a lineage. Why do we succeed evolutionarily as a lineage? But I'm more interested in dealing with the point you just made. Why did one part of that lineage, Homo sapiens sapiens, do extremely well in the long run, when all these other ones who seem to be doing okay went extinct?
Right. So what do you think is the key to our success?
So I think the key to human success is a kind of cooperation and a kind of group living that is similar and shares roots in a lot of the other primate and even mammalian patterns, but is distinct enough to get us to where we are. So I think a kind of hyper-cooperation, a kind of very, very interesting new socio-cognitive niche, a new way of being in the world that involves not just collaborating with others, but actually reshaping the social world and the ecological world in a way that being with others is the way in which we deal with the challenges of natural selection.
Okay, I want to break this down into parts a little bit, because it's a really interesting concept, and I want to make sure that everybody sort of understands where this fits relative to other kinds of primates, for instance.
Okay.
So other kinds of primates have social cooperation,
right,
of various kinds. Some kinds of primates have a lot of joint activity, a lot of what appears to be coordinated behavior, some of them less so. But you're looking at humans and thinking, this is different in some way.
Right.
Yeah. So how specifically do you see it?
So let's take a look at other primates first. So we see some really interesting cooperation in chimpanzees, maybe with hunting. Some groups of chimpanzees seem to cooperate while they hunt, others don't. We see in macaques, we seem to see social coordination within the group of when they're moving and where they're going. So that's really interesting. A really good example, too, is with the callitrichids. We see in sort of cotton-top tamarins, for example, mom and dad, a male and a female, cooperate extensively with each other and with their offspring to raise a family. So there's all kind of very, very interesting cooperative parenting going on. So that happens around in the other primates and, in fact, many social mammals. It also happens in humans. But in humans, we get not just cooperative parenting, not just social coordination, not just cooperation for hunting or foraging or gathering. We get a kind of food sharing at a level that we don't see in other organisms, for most part. We get a kind of shared intentionality, that is an ability to convey information and use that information to do things collectively that we don't see in other primates. We also have this ability to take our own kinship, that is those who we consider part of our family, and expand that well beyond even those who are biologically related to us. And finally, we have language now, which had to evolve, so arise sort of in different pieces over the course of evolutionary history. And that density of information and the amazing ability to talk about things that are not the here and now, that probably made a huge difference for us.
And what you're doing is you're saying, here's what we can do. What is the ecological setting in which those things make sense? and how does that impact the way that we interact with our environments, not only as individuals but as social beings?
Absolutely. So I would argue we create our social worlds in some ways. There's external influence. We live in the world, but that world is also modified by our actions, which then in turn have pressures that feed back on us. So we're sort of modifying the world as it modifies us. And many organisms do that. But we do that in a particular way. We do it as a group, and we do it by talking about it.
Right.
And those kinds of things are really interesting because two chimpanzees, you can see sometimes when they're interacting with one another, they can get incredibly frustrating because the information transfer isn't as coherent or complete as they want.
Right.
We have an amazing ability to convey incredibly dense and rich information, but we can also lie in ways that other things can't. So that makes our lives not only better to cooperate, but much more interesting to manipulate.
Okay. So this sort of brings us to the topic of niche construction. And you've really been a leader in thinking about the concept of niche construction and how that applies to our evolution. And it's a really central concept right now as people think about how evolution works in the 21st century. You know, how are we thinking about evolution now? One of the elements of this that's really shifted is niche construction. So could you give, sort of a quick explanation of what that is and how you think it fits?
Here's the primer on niche construction. Generally, people used to think evolution works like this, evolution via natural selection. Here's sort of an organism or a population of organisms. Here's the environment. Over time, the environment shapes what the organisms look like, right? So this is our standard view. Niche construction says that organisms' environments aren't really two separate things. They're mutually mutable. That is, they interface with one another, shaping each other. So as the environment impacts the organism, population of organisms, the organisms respond to that, impacting the environment. So what we see really is this sort of mutual shifting and changing over time. So that's the sort of cool 3D graphic that I don't have yet. But niche construction means that as we go through time, organisms respond to the environmental pressures, the selective pressures on them. Their responses then change that environment. So as we move through time, the next generation inherits an environment that has been impacted by the generation before them, which has new selective pressures or changed selection pressures, which they then respond to, changing that for generations to come. So the bottom line is that natural selection is still very important, but that organisms have a role in shaping the how and the ways in which natural selection is actually acting upon them. So there's a feedback system.
So for beavers, they're creating a dam, and that impacts where their offspring are raised and in the environment that they're in. For ants, there's the anthill.
Exactly.
For humans, you're saying this is
for humans,
else.
This is huge. So let's take earthworms, right? Darwin used this example without realizing he was pitching niche construction. Basically, you take a soil without earthworms, you put the earthworms in first generation, they consume the soil, they excrete out the soil. By doing so, they change the chemical structure of the soil and the structural content of the soil so that the selection pressures on subsequent generations of earthworms are quite different and much more favorable.
Yeah. You've been to Downhouse?
No, I have not been to Downhouse.
There's this great stone outside in his yard that he observed sinking year after year
with
because the earthworms were underneath of it. Yeah,
it's
exactly.
Brilliant. But it is a perfect example.
Yeah.
So in human niche construction, all you have to do is look around you today, and you can realize the human adaptive zone has been to deal with the environment by creating increasingly complex feedback loops of behavior, of physiology, and of perception that deal with the kinds of selection pressures we have. And so what's really interesting in human evolution for me is trying to combine the sort of mind, the body, and the actions into this feedback system and look into the past and see how pieces of it evolved. So humans construct their niches. We don't create our own reality. We don't play by a new rule set from other organisms, but we respond to those rules and bend the rules in ways that many other organisms cannot.
We live with the ideas of the past.
We live with the ideas of the past. We also live with the ecologies of former generations as they act on us and as we change them to act on our offspring.
How do you think that our study of human evolution should react to what's going on, both in evolutionary theory, in primatology?
Evolutionary biology is really dynamic right now. So is evolutionary ecology. I think the study of human evolution is lagging behind. I think we're not as connected to the real innovation in biology, in genomics, in epigenomics, as the study of many other organisms are. So human evolution needs to catch up and integrate more. It also has to move to an even more teamwork-based approach. It is no longer possible for single researchers to go out and do something major. Good answers require teamwork because there's too many skills. So to ask about human evolution, you need endocrinologists, you need fossil folks, you need osteologists, you need some people who can deal with genetics, you need some people who can deal with behavior. You also need ethnographers, you also need ecologists. You need to be able to place this big context. And so I think the future of the study of human evolution is going to be these big team-based projects. We're seeing that already in some very interesting outcomes, like the Lucida Language Project in the United Kingdom, where you get these huge conglomerates of different disciplines together to ask and maybe even answer really interesting questions about what it means to be and become human.
So you're a professor, like me, you're teaching students in a classroom. A student comes to you and says, I'm really interested in this area. What should I do to get into this? Right. You know, what would you tell them?
I would tell them to study biology and anthropology right now, because I think those are the two areas where most of the interesting things are going to be happening. They might also want to study philosophy of science if that's the track they want to take. But in biology and anthropology, these team-based approaches are starting to become dominant, especially when studying humans in general, living or past. And so by extending themselves in that direction and really training rigorously in those disciplines, they're going to have a much better chance at being able to do something in human evolution. I would also tell them to read a lot. Yeah. There's no way around it anymore. There's so much information out there. When I was an undergraduate student quite a while back, the density of information compared to what it is today, it's nothing.
Yeah.
You actually have to do more work now to get to the same level of understanding than you did a decade ago, or 2 decades ago, or 3 decades ago.
Yeah, it's really tough, isn't it? Okay, are there any other things that you think people ought to know that you want to share?
Well, I think what's really important is to point out that anthropology, specifically the study of human evolution within a broader anthropological context, has something to say for our modern world today. I'm a big fan of the so what, right? The world of academia and knowledge should have something to do with our daily lives. And understanding the human past in the context of the human presence tells us a lot about race and racism. It tells us a lot about human health. It tells us a lot about how humans can and cannot get along. I think there's a number of ways that we can understand or attempt to understand our world today if we're informed by our past.
Well, Agustín, thank you so very much. This has been great. I know that everybody who watches it is going to be enlightened, and you've just been wonderful.
Thanks. Well, thank you so much, and enjoy the class.